Right. A display there by members of the MK Military Veterans Association, currently on a display on that stage. Very important show of force, of course, understanding the backdrop of what's happening in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. The latest by-election telling you that the MK party has become a real factor. Those who are supporting former President Jacob Zuma in determining who runs, for example, municipalities. And of course, this is a battle clearly for the province of KwaZulu-Natal and who will run that province. You've got an IFP that is also launching its manifesto in March, having shown a degree of growth in the province and being bullish about it and quite robust to say they will continue to grow. An ANC that has barely managed to hold on to their eThekwini municipality, currently doing so via a coalition arrangement, and certainly wanting to continue to have a hold on KwaZulu-Natal. The Democratic Alliance declaring, of course, the Western Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, and most importantly, Gauteng to be their targets. And if they do manage to do that, it would mean they'll be holding a good 43% of the votes, if the numbers are correct. So KwaZulu-Natal, a very, very, very important province for the ANC. They've been there, and it does seem from what the president is saying, they're going to continue to be in that province with their activations and their focus in terms of what needs to be done. All right, yeah, that's the action there in KwaZulu-Natal. President Cyril Ramaphosa of the African National Congress in this time. Kwedemantachu is the chairperson, wanting to emphasize that point that there is no owner of the ANC. He is the 13th president. There have been 12 others before that, and he is presenting the manifesto as instructed by the NEC of the ANC, the highest decision-making body of the organization, saying there is no ANC of Ramaphosa. Well, the NEC has decided to give Ramaphosa 6 priorities to present as the 2024 manifesto priorities. And I'm joined now by political analyst Tessa Dooms for some analysis to what we've been hearing. Tessa, good to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So, let's start first with the optics. I don't know if anybody would have doubted that the ANC will fill the stadium. Yeah,
no. A party that can garner 10 million votes, that has, anywhere between 700,000 and 1 million members, depending on which results you think about, audited versus unaudited. All that is at stake here is whether or not they have the capacity in terms of resources, because it takes resources to get people to a stadium, and then whether or not they have the organizing power. And I don't think anyone has ever doubted the ANC's ability to do that. The question is whether or not you translate 75,000 people, 60,000 people, even if it's a bit lower than that, into 60%, 70% of the vote. That's the difference. These optics are part of our historical political culture, though, and tradition, right? So we were filling stadiums in the 80s and the 90s because that was the only way to mass communicate.
Right.
And we're hearkening back to that when we fill stadiums. So stadiums are about saying we are still part of this tradition where the people of the country come together in moments to hear politically. But we know that that's not necessarily where our political culture in real terms is now. The politics is happening in communities. The politics is happening online. The politics is happening in the airwaves.
Yeah.
And so when you do this, this is kind of this, it's props, you know. Stadiums are props to say that we still have organizing capacity, but it's not necessarily the translation into votes that I think it used to be.
But that in itself, I mean, does it speak of an organization that is dynamic, that is growing, or that has really known the tried and tested and they keep repeating it? I mean, I've even seen how they do their activations. It's still door-to-door. It's still, it's still the same way that the ANC has been doing their build-up to any election in the last 30 years. Very little innovation in how they are reaching out to the electorate.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always say about the EFF's, you know, big moment last year when Julius Malema ascended on that stage, is that even innovating that stadium, you know, optics, at some point you reach a crescendo in terms of what you can do with a stadium.
Yeah.
Even the door-to-door, you know, are people going to really open up their doors in a time of crime, in a time that people are not as, you know, receptive? So I do think that organizing strategies are evolving, and the question is the ANC's ground game evolving? Their stadium game, that's par for the cause. Their ground game is more important in terms of its evolution, because that's also where people get to respond to the ANC, where they get to engage with it in a more dynamic and robust way. And I think it's going to be interesting to see the ANC going out and having those direct conversations with voters to see if they can tug on the hearts of voters when they're engaged one-on-one. But we must also remember something about the ANC, and particularly the ANC, sometimes the DA, sometimes the EFF, that we also have political celebrities, right? That people are stunned to see somebody that they see on TV in real life. There's all of those kinds of dynamics. The big question for the ANC is, can it withstand the ground pressure? Can it organize community to community in the ways that it used to? And can it still win back the trust of those communities? I think one of the pressure points is also going to be the question of their lists, right? Yeah. We saw in 2021 there was a lot of community contestation of who ended up on the ANC lists. Communities sometimes wanted one person and the ANC, you know, leadership wanted another person. The list process is evolving in the ANC as it were. We heard the president today speaking about interviews. So what does that say for branch nominations? What has happened to this kind of democratic one-man, one-vote that the ANC is meant to be built on, that the branch decides who gets onto the list and the numbering on the list? So the move towards interviews, which ironically has been more of a DA tactic to interview candidates, does say something about moving where you think that the ANC can be most credible from the ground level into a more kind of palace politics level. And I think that's an interesting shift. I don't think the ANC trusts the ground as much as it used to.
And what would that certainly mean also for some of the candidates who are affected by the step aside? By the way, who they've brought back because of their constituency, and how important it was for them to show the kind of force that they're showing right now to be able to pull the numbers at Moses Mabhida.
I think Government Mbeki a few years ago started pointing to this, that the people with the largest constituencies are not necessarily the ones that have the clean track records, you know, in governance. So if you think about, you know, ANC politicians that haven't really had big scandals, a Buti Manamela or a David Masondo, you know, people ask where are the constituencies that they represent vis-a-vis a Nombula, who was all over the state capture inquiry, but Nombula stays relevant because constituency. Yeah. And so the ANC is having to answer the question about, should it be smaller and more quality? That was the Mbeki question. Should there be a smaller organization that produces more quality, or should there be a larger organization with organizers that are able to bring in numbers and then having to accommodate those people regardless of what their performance in government is? It's a big question for the ANC, and I think it's going to be hard to answer that question. The step-aside rule is one of those things that we're going to look out for when we look at those lists that come out. We're also going to be looking out just for the sense of younger people, levels of competence, whether they're going to be putting people, based on their qualifications or based on their areas of expertise. I mean, we've seen this round robin for the last 30 years of ministers who today are in education, tomorrow they're in health, the next time they're in defense. Nothing to do with their areas of competence. Yeah. Everything to do with their loyalty to the organization. Can the organization start showing a commitment to competence, a commitment to younger people, a commitment to people who are not just loyal to the party, but also competent in their areas of expertise? At
first glance, well, you mentioned that, I mean, it would be very difficult to say, I suppose, we're watching on screen, and anecdotally, when you look at it, is this a younger ANC? Is it an ANC of young people?
No, it's not a younger ANC. That stage is particularly not a younger ANC. One of the glaring parts of that for me is the ANC Women's League, actually. The ANC Women's League has been about older cadres for the longest time, and a constituency of older cadres. When young women have been crying out in the organization, they even created a young women's desk. And there's clear talent in terms of young women who have been activists in the organization that are just not emerging. I think of the organization in terms of young people, and I can think of many ANC young people I know have interacted with that I wonder, how are you not making it onto the list? And so I do think there's something still within the organization that's gatekeeping a lot. And you have to wonder, is it a matter of patronage? Or is it a matter of the queue is still long for who's supposed to be getting into positions? I think it's an indictment on the ANC that they're going to be putting forward a 70-plus-year-old presidential candidate in a country whose median age is 27. Yeah. But the fact that, that's where they are at speaks to the fact that the ANC has not opened itself up to the broad range of young talent that it should be able to attract by now. The rank and file of the ANC has mainly come out of universities. We know that the strength of SASCO, the PYA, has been where its leadership and its membership has gotten a lot of its traction. You cannot tell me that 30 years later, you're still struggling to get 20 and 30-year-olds. The Minister of, I think it's of Trade and Industry in Namibia, was announced last week as a 24-year-old, and was her second position. She was a deputy minister before that. How is the ANC not able to crack that 30 years into democracy? I think it's an indictment.
Let's talk about the 70-year-old. Does he really want it? I mean, if there's been talk at some point that he really signed out. He was done. He didn't want to be president. He was just done. It's like, oh, it's okay. Does it look like he wants another term?
His energy levels are probably higher than I've seen them in a long time. So Ramaphosa's energy levels in the last few speeches he's delivered has been higher. And I've been wondering what that's about, because I honestly do believe that he has a difficulty with wanting it. I think that this has been a difficult term for him. It's been a longer term than most get. It's been 6 years. Yeah. I don't think that he's had as much influence over the party as what he should have had. Everybody talks about his political capital, but I still hear many people in the ANC saying, we need to protect the president because, balance of forces are not always with him. So I do think that he's had a challenging time. Then COVID happened and all sorts of things. He's not ever given the sense that he really wants this job. But I do think there's a sense that he doesn't want to be the president that sinks the ANC. I think that legacy matters to this president a lot. How he's going to be represented in history matters to him. And I think he doesn't want to, be the one who took the ANC below 50% for the first time in the history books. I think it's a big motivating factor. And then also just keeping the ANC together. I think an ANC electoral loss, we've seen it in the Western Cape. Yeah. I think it's now, 15 years ago when they lost the Western Cape. They've not recovered. Yeah. They struggle to recover when they lose electoral power. Yeah. And so I do think that he's trying for the party. He's trying for history and his place in history, not to be the guy who sunk the ANC.
I mean, if you look at Tswane as well, once they lose power, they struggle
to get back.
But let's look then at what the priorities are that he has set up to try and get him that second term as the president of the country. The big issue, as you've put it, in his administration, and if you look at the review of their 2019 manifesto, is the fact that as top priority they had put in an inclusive economy for all. And under the economy, 102 commitments were made. But if you look at what they managed to do, is really just respond to COVID. So they'll tell you that there was TERS, there was SRD grants, there was 500 and something million that was given to SMMEs. In terms of what they did in that economic space, they managed to return the jobs that were lost during COVID and kept some from being lost. So 16.3 million jobs that would have been protected. But, you know, stressing the fact that we were occupied for 6 years in just keeping these jobs and making sure that people have got some kind of support. They come now, they're going to say, we're going to put South Africa to work. But still, again, they're talking of 2.5 million work opportunities. That's their big jobs plan.
Yeah, the jobs plan is scant.
Very scant. I mean, like 4 lines.
I think it's got 4 bullet points.
Yeah.
And I will give them, you know, some grace in saying that, you know, some of the stuff that's in the second priority around expanding the economy must have some job targets in it, but they've not been bold with job targets. So if you look at the EFF manifesto, for example, I think it's the only manifesto that's been incredibly bold about job targets. And we can interrogate whether those are realistic or not, but they've put their heads on the block about job targets. To talk about 2.5 job opportunities as the only number you put out, as the person in the governing seat.
Right.
I mean, as the person who has, and this president particularly, has had 3 job summits, investment summits, where numbers have come out in terms of how many billions are coming in what time frame, and how many jobs they're meant to produce. No scorecard on that is extremely telling. This is also the president who came in on the back of the YES program that was speaking about 1 million job opportunities in a year. It didn't deliver on that. But to still be talking about job opportunities, and he kind of slipped in almost like it was not in the speech, and decent work. But there's no decent work target. There's no target for what does it look like to get, particularly young people in this country, a job that lasts more than 12 months, a job that has a path you know, towards economic participation that's long-term. And I think what I was most disappointed in this manifesto is how little emphasis has been put onto small businesses. And so once they get into priority number 2, they're talking about 2,000 kind of mega industrialists, which I also think is a strange target in a country of 60 million people and so many young people unemployed. But there's just no sense that the ANC really is taking seriously small businesses, that it's taking seriously what it's going to do with the microeconomy. And all across the continent of Africa, that is what has fueled African economies to have lower rates of unemployment than we do. We know even in large industrial countries, small businesses are an engine room of jobs. So you look at a country like Germany that has huge manufacturing plants around cars and you know, big industries. But they also are looking at how small towns are being fueled by small businesses, mom and pop shops. There isn't this trade-off between the two. Tech industry businesses are meant to be small businesses. They're not big industrial businesses. For the ANC to focus on the big manufacturing sector and the financial sector as some of their big pillars tells me that they've not been thinking about small businesses and those opportunities. And we know that South Africans have been crying out for it. Part of the conversation about migrants has been about access to the informal sector. No real mention of the informal economy, even though Mbeki was talking about it 20 years ago, the need for us to think about what we do with the informal sector. I really think the ANC has missed an opportunity to talk about not just big industrialization, but how to get a more inclusive economy at the broadest base possible.
We'll put a little footnote there called set-asides, which in itself they're saying it's looking at least adding another 1 million jobs to the 2.5 work opportunities, where they're saying set-asides that would be at least put for women-owned businesses and youth-started businesses.
And again, set-asides are about a measure that includes after the fact. So your main target is the big formal sector. And then you say that formal sector must set aside for youth, must set aside for women. Women and youth make up the largest part of the working age groups in this country. Why are you having a 30% set aside for your largest workforce, for your largest economic drivers, which are young people? You should be flipping that around. You should be thinking this is the main place where we're going to start expanding opportunities, expanding jobs, and challenge big corporates to do more, whether it's absorbing into their own companies or paying higher taxes so that more can be created outside of that.
Yeah.
We're not creating a more competitive economy. We're saying, the big status quo in terms of big corporates must somehow just accommodate, as far as it is possible, smaller businesses. I don't think the priority is in the right place.
Yeah. Speaking of that, I mean, if there's anything to say about that is the vagueness of particularly that will engage private sector to come on board as well as create jobs, but they're not really saying what exactly is going to happen.
I mean, this president right now has a desk in his office where private sector, the big 40 JSE-listed companies, have a desk in his office, a project management desk around infrastructure and crime and all sorts of things. Why is that desk not delivering? It's got a big foothold in, the private sector's got a big foothold in to the president's presidential youth employment stimulus. Why are we not talking about real targets that the private sector need to reach? Why are we not talking about real commitments that the private sector can make, that the ANC can say, we can broker these deals because we know these people, they're already here, they're already working with us. That either says that they don't have confidence that the private sector wants to or can work with them on it, or that they don't have the will to make sure it happens. Either way, that part of it really sounds like a party who's not incumbent, not in government, and who's hoping for the best, that the private sector will come to the table when actually they have them at the table already and are not able to move the needle.
Cost of living is the third priority that they're going to tackle. They're going to strengthen social security, so more grants generally, and maybe keeping up with inflation. They are going to create more basket of products that are VAT exempted. I think that's what they're going to rely on. But they're also looking at the NHI, which he says he's found a pen somewhere that he's going to sign. I don't know what indication is that giving us, and he's going to deal with price fixing. But what I particularly found interesting was the emphasis on solar power. If they are going to fix ESCOM, why do they still see solar power as being a part of what they're doing going forward?
Well, the real answer is that solar power should have been part of the ESCOM mix a long time ago. We know that as early as 1999, the ANC government then was told they need an energy mix. It was written into the NDP now over 12 years ago that they need to have an energy mix. And ESCOM should have been at the heart of that energy mix. Instead, we've built 2 more coal-fired powered stations in the last 10 years, and still no state-owned or publicly owned real infrastructure around
which we have paying to pay.
Around renewables and around nuclear. We've not actually built energy that's privately owned. And one of the things about the energy and the green energy debate in this country that we skirt around, because even social justice activists who are really pushing for a more green economy know that the debate is that a lot of the green energy is in private hands. Can we trust those private hands to have fair pricing, affordability? Can we trust the state to regulate that in a decent way? We've seen so much privatization of what I think of as core goods in this country. We've seen healthcare privatized as a core good in this country in a way that makes it, you think of yourself as doing well in South Africa when you can opt out of the public health system into private care. That's how we measure it. Education is the same. Security is the same. And, we don't want to get to the point where we have privatized every real public good that this country needs to run on. And energy is one of them. And so how we regulate for solar and how we make that part of what government introduces over the next 5 to 10 years needs to be something that we can trust is not going to exclude more people than it includes. I think it's going to be interesting to see whether it's a part of the ESCOM project or whether it's something that is purely in private hands and whether we can regulate it sufficiently. Yeah,
so, I mean, a target and a commitment like the NHI, which by all means and purposes looks like is going to be caught up in litigation, is something that 6 years from now the president can come and say, well, I mean, we tried to put it up and it was opposed.
It's again that relationship with the private sector, right? The ANC claims to be the leader of society. That must mean it's also the leader of the private sector. It must be able to broker a private sector that is patriotic, a private sector that acts in solidarity, and a private sector that does more good than harm. I don't know whether the ANC can confidently say that it can do that at this point. It should be more confident in its relationship with the private sector. I think the NHI is going to be interesting because the NHI actually relies on a strong public health care system. And I think it's leaning more towards the strains and the resources that's going to be required in the private sector. That's what the private sector is worried about, what it loses in this game. If we had a stronger public health care sector, the NHI would be easier to implement.
Yeah.
And I think that...
Because you wouldn't care what the private sector says.
Right, because that means actually people in the private sector...
We've got our hospitals, they work, and we're pushing
would be able to opt into the private healthcare when they can't afford, or public healthcare when they can't afford private. But also you can cross-subsidize. That's the point of the NHI. But
in this instance, you're relying more on the private to actually assist, like we saw during COVID-19.
Absolutely. And I think there are just, again, some fundamentals that we need to start getting right. You know, I said this morning to a group of psychoanalysts, believe it or not, that the job of a government is to keep us alive and well. You know? So things like energy is about keeping us alive and well. Things like healthcare is about keeping us alive and well. Things like policing and security is about keeping us alive and well. And the more that that's just in private hands and we don't have, you know, state and public access to those things, the worse it is. I mean, one of the things that struck me as really a low target is 10,000 new police officers.
Yes.
That seemed to me like a grossly low target. I think one province
120,000
from
the last time I looked.
I think that, you know, one province could ask for 10,000 more police officers. I think there was a stat last year that showed that we had 100,000 more private security in the country than we had actual people in the police force. They filled a stadium of 75,000 people, but only 10,000 new police officers in a country with extraordinarily high crime rates. There's something about the ANC's boldness to commit to claims that should really actually worry us all. They, as the state, need to take more ownership in delivering or being able to say how they're going to get the private sector to deliver if more things are privatized.
ANC launching in its manifesto of 2024. Moments ago, you had the president trying to unpack what they've got in that manifesto and what they're promising to the electorate should they get back into power. Sandy Leswana, political analyst, joining us. Tessa Dooms is with me here in the studio. Leswana, good evening. Good afternoon, rather, beg your pardon. Good to have you with us. Lacking in boldness to commit for a party that is been in power for 30 years. It's the sixth administration, even though the president boasts about being the only party that has the experience to can implement. From the 2019 one, where 221 commitments were made, one is looking at this list and thinking there's not many clear commitments that would have been made. Is this maybe out of fear that, look, we promised a lot the last time and didn't deliver much on what we had promised?
Thank you so much, Dooms, and to the viewers of Newzroom Afrika and to Tessa in your studio. Let's say this, that from where I'm sitting today, listening to this manifesto speech, historically, it reminded me of the so-called Rubicon speech of P.W. Botha in 1985. When, in fact, P.W. Botha needed to announce to the nation that we're now finishing apartheid in South Africa. And he himself started telling the Afrikaner people how strong they are and how they can run this economy without the world, how they can just be so successful without anybody, and to continue the status quo. So there is a part in what Ramaphosa said which says that there is nobody who can run this country like the ANC. The only people who have the capacity to run this country is the ANC.
Yeah.
So we remember very well that after P.W. Botha said that in 1985, it was a short period after that the National Party ceased to exist, and P.W. Botha went to live in the wilderness and died there himself. So Cyril Ramaphosa needed to make a step change. Now, a big step change, and the big step change, 95% really of what needed to be said and what needs to be corrected in South Africa is strictly the HR of the state. The people who run our municipalities, who run our SOEs, who run government departments, are not fit and proper for office. They are not skilled enough. They don't have the correct moral outlook and the correct ethical culture. So the biggest problem, 95% of the problem in South Africa is in fact the HR problem. And a big percentage of the HR problem that we have is in fact the cadre deployment. So when you talk about being reluctant to make promises, it is because he knows that he doesn't have right now, starting with himself, people who are capable of delivering anything, whether it is to end load shedding, whether it is to make sure we have clean water every day, whether it is to make sure that the 200 buildings that are hijacked in the city of Johannesburg, as well as the 200 or so private residences that are hijacked, and many other land parcels that are hijacked in the city of Johannesburg and beyond, Cape Town and elsewhere, that the state takes control and ends the lawlessness. He simply does not have those people in office right now. Yeah. He cannot deliver anything and is not delivering anything. So he cannot make definite promises.
One might say that if you look at their priority 4, invest in people, normally when we speak of national elections, we don't speak of bread and butter issues where the tire hits the tar, so to speak. But he managed to sneak that in because he realizes that, I suppose, for most South Africans, that's what they are concerned about. They're not concerned about these high-level policies to talk about. They want to know if you can deliver water, if public transport will work, if schools will work, if there will be healthcare, if you will build houses. And he seems to have snuck that in by saying national and provincial are going to support local government. That's the promise that they're making to deliver these things that otherwise local government should be able to deliver by itself.
From my point of view, that priority 4 and the issues you are raising, for me, I don't think anybody should talk, whether it's Action SA or any other political party of the ANC, should talk without addressing that. Now, let's take some of these things. The first one, he says national government will intervene where local government is failing. So we know the city of Mangaung is failing. A very large percentages of ANC municipalities are failing totally. And those are in the reports of the Auditor General and other reports. Now, Ramaphosa, let me then make this anecdotal remark about this. From the year 2007 till 2021, December 2021, I was one of the lecturers in the municipal finance program at BITS to define and give people the minimum competencies required to run municipalities. That requires that those who do not meet the minimum competency requirements are removed from municipalities. And those who actually meet the minimum requirements are then installed. Till today, from 2007, there is no president, there is no minister, not even the ANC, no SG, no president of the ANC, no chairman. It has never happened till today. We lectured, we taught year in, year out, week in, we trained people, making them ready for that. It has never been implemented. So this is another pipe dream where there is neither the courage nor the people to actually, who already in the state. The people who can do this are outside the state. They are not in the state. They are not in position. So that is one of the problems, and it does need to answer as to how is this thing going to happen.
Yeah.
How is it going to happen? We cannot talk about high-level stuff. We need to know how is it going to happen.
Yeah, that's exactly the question that Tessa asked. I just said, says national and provinces are going to have. You say, how? How?
And, you know, there are answers to the how.
Yeah.
And that's what this manifesto also lacks. For an incumbent government, the question is not what. We know the whats. The whats are everywhere. The question is how. How are you going to do what you haven't done already, what you haven't been able to do? And I think that what Prof. Swana is actually pointing to is that question about the state machinery and whether the ANC has been a good custodian of that machinery so that it can deliver. One of the questions around the state capture question is not the high-level politicians only. And I know we focus on the high-level politicians, but what I learned from the state capture, and I'm probably one of those people who watched 95% of that whole thing live. I didn't have a life comment, so it was tough. But what I learned from it is how much is happening at a very minuscule level with bureaucrats here and there. I mean, there are people whose names we've never known and we should never have known. But low-level bureaucrats have a lot of power in the system. And so when they are deployed and they're not capable or they're not credible or they're not trustworthy, it does sully the entire process. Yeah. You can't do your what.
I mean, essentially it means Senzo Mkhunu will be doing what he's doing. He'll go to Phoenix. He'll go to... every time there's a pipe that is not working, he'll have to come down and say, make sure that there's water flowing in that pipe.
And it would be better for the party if, number one, they committed to a meritocracy within the bureaucracy. They committed to the same thing that they're doing with people on their lists, interviewing them to make sure that they're good and proper, to make sure that that's also happening within the bureaucracy, that we depoliticize especially roles that are not meant to be political. At this point, we have a turnaround of 2.5 years per DG. Our DGs stay for very short spaces of time. That means they're highly politicized because they're in and out with ministers as ministers are moving and changing and ministers' whims change. How much more the other parts of the bureaucracy? I really think that that's a really important point that we can't miss out on. But the other thing that you raised was how the sneaking in of local government has happened and why it needs to happen. The truth is that the ANC has a service delivery problem. It just has a service delivery problem. And that's not just a national and provincial bureaucratic problem or policy problem. It is, does the ANC know how it is going to affect service delivery and ensure that its cadres deliver on services? I don't think it has checks and balances for its cadres. You know, we can talk about cadre deployment. Cadre deployment would not bother us if the ANC knew how to check and balance their cadres. And I don't think they know how to do that, especially at the municipal level where it matters the most. I think this is the election actually of service delivery. I know that it seems like it's a local government issue, but it's very much an issue about, do we have the political will to make sure that the entire chain works? If I was the ANC, what I would have said today about local government is that we are making the commitment to send our best deployees to local government where service delivery is at the coalface. That they can make as a national government promise. That they are going to, as this party, make sure that they set a precedent that their best people are going to be where the service delivery is at the coalface.
I listened to the media briefing of Mbalula following the court ruling now, the High Court, about the constitutionality of the kind of deployment. And he read past, I suppose, resolutions of when this decision would have been taken. When you listen to them, those resolutions are good and proper, and I'm sure you're well versed with them in terms of what they were trying to do, to say, look, we'll get the best amongst us to try and deploy them into these positions so that public service can be influenced by the policies of the party, and he outlines what would have been the process. But we know in implementation, because even by their own admission, they say in implementation something went wrong in terms of who they put into those positions to occupy those spaces. Now the president insisting again, no, this is our correct cadre development and deployment policy. You ask the question again, how? How are they going to prevent that wrong thing that they also admit happened previously from not happening again?
Yeah, let me just add a little bit to what Tessa was talking about. Two cases. Clover disinvested from Lichtenberg. I hope you are aware of that, and
yes,
left for KZN.
Yes.
The question then that you and I must ask, is that a local problem? Is that a provincial problem? Is that a national problem? That could be a question, a rhetorical question I'm asking. Then, Secondly, last week, I think it is Escort, that Poloni company or whatever it is, that were opening another plant expanding in Lised in Heidelberg. And they were complaining about the infrastructure, but also said now they've safeguarded themselves by installing their own water purification plant, their own electricity in terms of solar and other things. So an investor who comes in now into any geographic area in South Africa, you come with your own municipality. In other words, you come with your business and you also come with your own municipality in a briefcase. So the question would be, is that really a local government issue, or is this now a big national question? That is what I will talk about. Coming to the issue of the so-called cadre deployment, around the year 2000, around that time, 2000 and 2001, I might confuse the two dates, but I think it was 2000, year 2000, in fact, in the NGC of the ANC, where they pronounced on the question of the new cadre, not just cadre deployment, the new cadre, because they realized that the era that they've ended in of being a governing party now needs a totally different type of cadre to the one who was throwing stones or ducking in the bushes in Zimbabwe, Uganda, and Muhorohoro, and wherever they were ducking. They needed a new cadre. And so there was a document and a discussion, resolutions, documents, and workshops around that. And then a year later, I think it was in 2001, they produced a document that said, through the eye of the needle. Now, I'm saying this to you, that in 24 years, they've actually been trying to change the caliber of the cadre that they deploy. In 24 years, they've not been able to do it. Not at all. Instead, we've seen more positions, and you'll forgive my language, being occupied by careerists in the ANC, by opportunists, by corrupt criminals, and counter-revolutionaries. Those four types of people are now in office. They are not the new cadre. They have not gone through any eye of the needle. And when they get into office, they bring in and deploy people like themselves. So that when you sit in the police station today with a police officer, you might as well be sitting with a mafia. And some of our top investigators and top police officers have been, like Kenya in the Western Cape, have been assassinated with the help of police officers themselves. Some of the criminals are armed, but with weapons from the state, either through the military or through the police. So that is the problem that is there. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Right. Putting South Africa to work, building industries, tackling the high cost of living, investing in people, defending democracies, and a better African world. Tessa Dooms with us, and political analyst Saninde Swana also helping us to put it together. Defend our democracies, priority number 4, Tessa, where again, safety is going to come up there, which I suppose is that question that you raised around 10,000 police, right? Making safer communities and safer homes to live in. They talk about support for military vets. They talk about what we just spoke about now, fighting corruption, building a developmental state, and promotion of national building. Again, how?
So firstly, I'm horrified that the security question is being discussed under the defense of democracy. The security question is a question about people's lives and livelihoods. It is not a question about democracy. When you start talking about the military and the police as the defenders of democracy, that worries me greatly, because that speaks to police state type thinking. You're thinking that you're going to have to, like, who are these police coming to defend democracy against? Yeah. The police are policing us as citizens. Are we the threat to democracy? That is a very worrying place for that to surface. But the broader narrative about defending democracy is a global narrative. We'll know that democracy is under threat around the world. You see some of the oldest democracies in the world where people are starting to push towards more authoritarianism, wanting more populist governments, and not believing necessarily that the institutions of democracy are serving everyone. And so we're seeing that trend around the world, which is being met with an anti-authoritarian, anti-populist rhetoric and this idea of defending democracy. I personally subscribe to the idea that we need to innovate rather than simply defend democracy. And the difference between that is when you say defend democracy in a country like ours, if you're 30 years old or younger in this country, all you've known is a democracy, right? But you also are part of 34% unemployment, 70% youth unemployment. You're also part of a country that has 6 million people living in shacks. You're also part of a country where people's water, sanitation, and electricity is not a guarantee. You think that that's what democracy delivers. The failures of government give democracy a bad name and have given democracy a bad name. So when you now have to talk about defending democracy against your own people, it's because you and your failures have given democracy a bad name. The best way to defend democracy is to deliver services under democracy. Not to just talk about the fact that our judiciary still works, or that our elections are still credible, or that we have the best constitution in the world. That actually tells young people, you can have all of the ticks for a good democracy, and my life can still be bad. That gives democracy a very bad name. There's an Afrobarometer study that came out last year that said 72% of South Africans would forego having a vote if they could get development. That is a very that keeps me up at night. And so for me, we need to ask, is this democracy, the way that we're doing it, serving the needs of people? Is it producing the dividend for young people who've only lived in a democracy? And if it isn't, how do we make sure that democracy delivers? Not just functions, but how do we make sure it delivers? And I think that this government has missed an opportunity to make sure it delivers rather than just buffing up the police so that if we rebel, then they have someone to shoot us. That's a terrible way to think about it.
I know you want to weigh in on that question of the security cluster being put there inside defending our democracy, but I also want you to speak about building a developmental state. Does it fit in that concept of building a democracy?
Yeah, I have 2 points there. I will not cover, obviously, she stepped me up when she was talking. Building the developmental state and promoting nation building and social cohesion. So let me comment on those two. Right. You know, as a young man, I was an enforcer, one of the enforcers of the sports boycott against South Africa. And I was a rugby player. Now, South Africa has won 4 rugby World Cups since the sports boycott was stopped. And that's a world record. Nobody has done that. And Ramaphosa, in today's speech, mentioned this. What he did not mention is what has the state done for its part to make sure that each player there got a fair chance to be a Springbok and to compete for the World Cup. Does the child born in the village of Gulu or in Lebode or Luzupu somewhere in a place like that have a chance, or even Soweto? I don't even know if Soweto has produced a Springbok until now. What have they done? He talked about Amapiano being an influence around the world. What he did not talk about is what has the external state done to make sure there's Amapiano. I can go on with all this Jerusalem and Tyler who are winning awards around the world. Our children are succeeding without any aid from the state. And if you look at an All Blacks player, he is developed from pre-primary school until he becomes an All Blacks player and is maintained by the system throughout his life as a player. So I am saying this is a government that is sitting there, and when something happens by itself, they claim all the glory for it, when they have contributed absolutely nothing. So the raw talents of South Africa, which are world-class talents, are left unattended. So when you talk about the developmental state itself, the developmental state, then you have to say, what is your theory of the state? There are public services as public goods and services that the state is bound to produce. For instance, there was a court case, I believe, where Cyril Ramaphosa argued that it's got no duty to provide electricity. And the court told him that it's your duty to provide this electricity. So the state cannot be there to conduct arbitrary activities. There are goods and services that must be provided equally to everybody. So if you are born in the Western Cape, in the rural areas of the Western Cape, or born in Randburg, Sandton, you must get the same equality if the state is democratic of services. To me, that would be a developmental state that says everybody must get every day, all the time, as is necessary and prudent, all the services on equal terms.
Sandile Swana, Tessa Dooms, I appreciate you both.